It's a very poignant, sad topic, I'm afraid, but I'm actually very excited to share. It's been something I've been working on for 18 months, I suppose, very close to my heart, as I'm sure these topics are very close to a lot of our hearts. So this is the first time I've presented it properly, publicly, but this is based on a paper that came out last week that I'm still very excited to see. So thank you for listening in advance. So I'm talking to you today about Domesticating Responsibility, Refugee Hosting and the UK's Homes for Ukraine scheme. So I'll tell you a bit about the UK's Homes for Ukraine scheme. I mean, every country in Europe has been doing something similar. I'm not standing here and saying the UK is special in any way, but that's the one I've had access to, it's the one I've been researching, and I think that it has implications or its relevance for lots of other countries and for refugee hosting in particular. There's lots of things I could be writing from this project. There's lots of material I've got. I started with this theme of responsibility. It's buying me time before I delve more into the narratives of displacement, which is what I want to do, but I wanted to ease myself in. I wanted to really understand and take that really seriously. So I've started with the more sort of conceptual idea of responsibility. You know, who's responsible for resettling refugees, and what does it mean when we use private homes to do so? So that's what I'm talking about today, but hopefully this is the start of lots more things I'd like to write and talk about from this work. So for some background, in the UK, we have this department called Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, DLUC. I'm not going to bore you with discussions about the Conservative government in the UK. I'm sure some of you follow the news. But this is the department that's responsible for communities and housing, you know, particularly. It's normally the Home Office that is responsible for asylum and refugees. In the case of the Homes for Ukraine, it was this Housing and Communities department which took responsibility, or was given responsibility, more accurately, for administering and sort of organising the scheme. So immediately there was a sort of power tussle, I think, between the Home Office and this department, which is not unusual in our current government. That's all I'm going to say about that. But they launched this scheme in March 2022. There were other schemes that were launched. There was a family visa scheme, so Ukrainians in the UK already were able to bring people over. There's still people, I think, coming separately outside of the scheme, but it's this scheme that I've focused on particularly for, you know, to have some coherence. So this urged the public to come forward and offer their spare rooms, to accommodate people who were coming from Ukraine. And this is the first time really that this has happened in the UK. So obviously it's happened elsewhere. I know it's been happening in Germany in the past and recently. It's happened in the Netherlands, it's happened in Canada. But in the UK, it's actually quite a step change in refugee resettlement. And there's lots of things to think about with that, especially in the UK context. So over 131,000 people have been sponsored and housed through the programme, and it's predominantly been women and children. Immediately there's an absence there. There have been men, men have come through this scheme. I didn't manage to talk to any. There were some I could have talked to. It became too difficult with language. I tried to set up an interview with one and it fell through. But I suppose the predominant narrative immediately is it's women and children, and I think that's significant when we think about how these movements are gendered and racialised. So in more detail, the scheme is, it's interesting when we think about responsibility, because actually the efforts of the scheme, first of all, are devolved to local authorities. So in the UK, we have a series of sort of counties, and we have local authorities, and they have their councils. Bigger ones have a bigger scheme, sort of metropolitan sort of areas. Smaller ones are just sort of county councils. But they all have their responsibility for their local areas. So the Department of Levelling Up basically handed it over to local councils, local authorities. And the first thing to say, it's not on the slides, is that local authorities do everything differently to each other. It's quite interesting, the different approaches they have. If you spend a time on the internet looking at their different websites, they are all doing it differently. So there's a sort of duplication of effort, which is quite interesting to see there. But so the scheme was actually set up with money behind it. So there was money for this. The UK government did find money. Hosts were receiving thank you payments. Local authorities were receiving £10,000 per person. That changed over time. And if we look at what guests, and I'm going to use the word guests, caveating that some of the language around this needs unpicking, but for simplicity now I'm going to use the words hosts and guests. Guests are issued with 3-year visas. They can work. In fact, there's actually an expectation to work, which is unusual and has been problematic, but again, that's something for another day. Can claim benefits and actually are allowed to have recourse to state funds. They can have social housing. The first thing to say is how different that is compared to any other group who's coming through the asylum process. We've had other refugee resettlement schemes. This one does seem to be particularly generous. And if we think of the immediate criticisms of the scheme, I suppose that's the one that stands out. Why would Ukrainians be given this very generous package of visas when most people, the UK government isn't known for issuing visas quickly or reliably? Why would this be able to happen in this case? Particularly work. Asylum seekers in the UK can't work, and housing is terrible, I think it's fair to say. There are dispersal schemes. We've had very high-profile media reports in the last few months of sort of increasingly harsh rhetoric of what to do with asylum seekers, new asylum seekers, and we've had a barge, a Bibi Stockholm barge, that people have been it's been used to put asylum seekers on, and there's been, I think it's Legionnaire's disease, or there's been all sorts of things, and unfortunately, really, really sadly, suicide as well. So the stakes couldn't be higher for the harsh environment, I think, that new asylum seekers have in the UK. But of course, Ukrainians, they're not treated as new asylum seekers. They've been given a pre-approved status, so they have that visa. So you can't really compare, but you also cannot help but compare because the juxtaposition is so hard. And of course, because it's a white Christian, predominantly female and young people, children population, you do start to ask questions compared to, we've just had the so-called refugee crisis. Went to an exhibition at one of the museums yesterday. Immediately it talks about, the Syrian refugees and what a challenge it was. And we know how gendered and racialised those discourses have been. There is something interesting there. Although as a scholar of East European migration, I would point out that East Europeans are certainly not, safe from being racialised, and there are particular racialisations that go around East European identities, but again, that's something to work through later. So we've got this context, and I want to start with that critical context. So everything I say now, that's the context around it, but I also feel that you can get so far by criticising, but we also have to actually dig in a bit deeper. And, I can't just stop there and go, oh, well, that's a racist scheme, or why, because I don't think that actually tells us an awful lot. So I wanted to dig in and see what this scheme means. And particularly here today, think about responsibility. Because I think these are actually huge questions about who is responsible for settling refugees. And also as geographers, where does that happen? So the fact that this is happening in domestic space, I think is really significant. And I know other scholars have looked at it in different contexts. I don't think that means that, we've exhausted those questions and perhaps concerns. So it's thinking about, is the state stepping back? And if it is, what's taking its place and what are the implications of that? So, the academic context for this, I'm sure you'll be familiar with some, if not all of these literatures, and I've been enjoying weaving them together and thinking about how they all meet. So the responsibilisation literatures about individuals taking on more risk, states stepping back, particularly in the neoliberal context, which I think the UK safely sits in, and what that means, particularly the impact on health and social policies. But what it means, I really like the arguments about how the more you devolve responsibility, the messier it becomes. The less regulation there is, or maybe that's a good thing sometimes, but also it means that it's less predictable. And I think that's a really important argument for this. In the UK in particular, there has been a very explicit effort to push the state back with the Tories, the Conservative government. So in 2010, what was the Lib Dem and Conservative government launched their Big Society agenda, which was very explicitly aimed to get communities to take more responsibility for communities. And there was a lot of sort of critique of that at the time. But it goes hand in hand with austerity and cuts. So I know, talking to Katrina, I know that there have been cuts here and everywhere, really. In the UK, it has been quite, extreme, perhaps. We've had, huge amounts of cuts. Lots of our councils are on the brink of bankruptcy, struggling to fulfil basic services. All the low-hanging fruit is gone. So we're in a sort of very, very difficult climate. And it's very easy to see how the austerity and the responsibilisation goes hand in hand. You make more cuts, you put more responsibility onto individuals, probably without the support that is needed. So we have that. We bring in the refugee interest, and we see that in this context, it's not surprising that third sector involvement has grown. Some of this is piecemeal, ad hoc. Refugees need support. Who's going to offer that? Well, it's charities. Sometimes it's even individuals. Some of those core services then become offered in a sort of piecemeal, unpredictable way sometimes, but through a lot of care, a lot of love, a lot of effort, a lot of solidarity. So we have community refugee programs, volunteers. Johnny Darling, geographer, has talked about housing and how dangerous it is when housing is outsourced, and the sort of terrible conditions of housing, the unsafe housing asylum seekers are placed in the UK. Particularly at the moment, there's lots of cases about mould and how the impact on health, and how all this again is raced and gendered. Which refugees are welcome and looked after and which ones aren't. So we can see how those literatures fit together. And then, of course, there's the international context, the refugee sponsorship that's been happening elsewhere, in Europe, in Canada, in America, interest in sort of whether it's actual domestic hosting or whether it's the buddy schemes. I've certainly read stuff about Germany here as well, and how this has grown again in response to Ukraine. So it's also acknowledging that, of course, the UK's the numbers of people the UK has been supporting pales into insignificance if we look at other countries, particularly Poland, Moldova. Proportionally, the UK hasn't stepped up, I would say, in the way other places have. But a lot of this stepping up has been individual efforts. And we could spend time delving into different attitudes to the state. There's a fantastic PhD being worked on at the moment in the UK on Lithuania and the Lithuanian, it could be Latvia, I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but the different attitudes to the state. The idea that the state, why would the state even care? And the regional proximity. Like, of course we're here to host Ukrainians, it could have been us, it could be us next. So I can't go into that today, but we have that different context. Literature's about hospitality and welcome. Who's welcome, who isn't, the fact that hospitality is never unconditional, the sort of politics of sanctuary, the threats to reciprocity and those uneven power dynamics, and the caring and kinning work that goes with looking after people, supporting people, and particularly how gendered that is, which comes through in my interviews a lot. And then bringing all this together, I think, is work on the geographies of home, because the fact that it's in domestic spaces is really significant. I love the work of Susanna Burikova, her work on au pairs. It's just so vivid when she talks about the awkwardness in the space and the power dynamics of being an au pair in someone's home, and how you feel when you can't access the fridge, or when the man in the house is behaving strangely and you're this young woman and you feel a bit weird about that. It's amazing work, and I think it's probably one of the most useful things I'm going to find in this. But also thinking about the geopolitics of the home. So these hosting homes are now tapped into Ukrainian timelines, tapped into Ukrainian news. I was staggered by the host's knowledge about Ukraine. They'd all learned enormous amounts about Ukraine. They could reel off the place names, the geography, the latest atrocities. So this sort of geopolitics of home came through very strongly. And challenging assumptions about domestic space, going right back to Rachel Payne's work. We know domestic space. I mean, we don't have to keep saying it. We know that domestic space can't be assumed to be safe. It's an obvious argument. But underlying this, Homes for Ukraine, as in the UK, the stay home COVID, and elsewhere, there is still this assumption that domestic space is special, it's safe, and it's a sanctuary. And I think, that has to be, you have to ask questions about that. So lots and lots of different debates to tap into and weave together that help analyse the work. So what did I do? Well, I was moved to do this. The funding actually came later. I got impact funding after I'd done the work so that I could do something useful with it. because I felt that I really should be doing something useful with that. And in the UK, we've had an impact drive, and I can see merits as well as pitfalls. And it's got me working with my local council, using my work to help make guides to help people. And perhaps I'm reinforcing the responsibilisation, but I suppose if it does some good, that's better than no good. So there's always that ethical conundrum there. But my sister also took in a Ukrainian woman, and having studied Poland and the region and been talking about teaching the geopolitics of the region through my Poland module at the university, I suppose I took it personally, even though I'm not Ukrainian. I suppose a lot of us feel like this, different conflicts. I just had to research it. I didn't really have a plan. I just started. I had an ethics application, and I started doing some interviews. So I started in June 2022, and I did my last interviews in September, just gone. Most interviews were an hour. They were semi-structured. So I did 58. All just me, all by myself. So that was quite a big undertaking. So it was sort of this emotional drive that made me do it. So I spoke to representatives from the government, from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, just one, 3 local authority representatives from different parts of the UK, 2 in England, in the north and the south, and 1 in Wales. And it's not a lot. I tried. I was cold call emailing. It was incredibly hard to get responses. So I haven't got a lot of those interviews, but they were very candid. And so I've had to be very careful how I present them and how I protect their anonymity. Lots of people working in charities and people working informally, and we'll see how important their roles have been as we go through. But through my sister's networks, she's very social media savvy. She put my advert on her social media, and by this point hosts have been supporting each other through social media, through WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups. So that was a really important part, because they didn't feel supported otherwise. So it was a sort of mutual support. But she put my advert on, and I was actually overrun with people who wanted to be interviewed. It was a very unusual situation when you're trying to find people to speak to. So I limited it to 30 hosts, 10 in Wales, 20 in England. And then I put in a second ethics application, a more sensitive one, had to go for central review, and that was to speak to Ukrainian women themselves. And I think I'd been wary. I'm always wary of this. I don't want to be exploitative. There's always a balance. Is it actually useful to talk to people or not? And I was urged by some very good colleagues who said, you can't leave those voices out. And they were right. And so I did it. And I managed to speak to 15 Ukrainian women. 3 I had translation support. Some women were perfectly fluent in English. Some had been learning and wanted to talk to me in English anyway, even though they'd only been learning a little while. And they were incredibly moving and important interviews. We were in tears, in a lot of them. And, I'm so grateful and thankful that they wanted to share. And so that's partly my motivation to work with the council. Something good can come of it. So yes, so that's the research. So let's get to the themes and the sort of substance. The first is the big question about the politics of responsibility. And I felt this was fascinating, and it came through in the interviews really clearly. And I think I hadn't been looking for it, and it was the interviews that showed me, I think, what the arguments were here, particularly with the local authority interviews and with the central government interview, that one person. Because I hadn't really thought critically about this scheme and why it was happening in the way it was. I was more interested in the people's experiences, the hosting in the home. And then I realised there was a bigger politics here. And there was something important about asking people to step up. And, this was what came through in the local authority. They were quite, willing to tell me these thoughts. So the Welsh local authority said, the difference of the Ukraine scheme is that the UK government asked people to open up their homes and become sponsors. And that's not happened with other schemes. They thought, right, we're never going to be able to manage this. Let's ask people in the community to open up their homes. So this is happening in the context of, we'll see later, a housing crisis in the UK, but also a capacity crisis, or maybe it's a manufactured capacity crisis. There's certainly a sense that there isn't much resourcing to support asylum seekers and refugees. Housing is incredibly expensive. People from Afghanistan have been housed in hotels for years, And I think central government has been very keen to stop that happening because it's very expensive and it's criticised in sort of political levels and in media discourse. So there was a real sense that we do want to support Ukraine. There was Boris Johnson personally offering his support. You know, we do actually want to join in this effort, but we don't have the resources or capacity. So whether that's, you know, whether there is the resources, there was certainly a sense that it wasn't there. So the idea that was you can offload that to ordinary people. So there is this wider political context. Somebody from the Northern Council said Homes for Ukraine is a do-it-yourself resettlement programme. The responsibility has been put to the British public for this programme. And what's fascinating for me now is I never said the word responsibility, I think, in my questions. It just came through. So it was obviously there in people's minds, you know, who's responsible for this. So we can see this sort of bigger picture. And then when you talk to the person inside DLUC, Department of Levelling Up, this person was responsible for an evaluation of the scheme and were quite critical and candid, and I sent them their transcript back and they were quite laid back. So I thought, okay, well, I'll hide your identity, but I got to use some of these things because what they said was really interesting. So on top of this wider context of wanting to, you know, share out that responsibility, there was something quite specific that came through about, and again, it's one person, but it's one person who was close to those decisions. A sense of a government that was reluctant to actually get involved in the domestic intricacies of the scheme. So it was one thing to make that decision to pass it on to private homes, but it's another thing to think too deeply about what those private homes might need, what that would look like. So this person said, from the government's point of view, they're like, whoa, we don't want to enter that space. So we don't want to enter the domestic space, which I think, as geographers, I think that's really fascinating, that the government purportedly wanted to use the space but not enter it themselves. You know, there's a real sort of gap emerging straight away with that responsibility. And so they say the tension between government not wanting to enter the home, metaphorically, to hosts wanting the trust of government entering the home, and then having that handoff so that third-party agencies are meeting that unmet need of support. And this crystallises what's happened with the scheme, is that homes have been used, hosts have wanted support, they've expected government of some description, local, central, I don't think people really care, they've expected there to be a government infrastructure. And what they found is there's been lots of gaps. And I suppose to a certain extent that's understandable. It was a very hastily put together scheme. Nothing before had existed. It was an emergency response. But it meant that there were lots of gaps, and filling those gaps were charities, voluntary sector, individuals stepping up and doing things. And that just makes people feel uneasy. And very easy, I suppose, to turn around and then criticise the lack of planning. Again, it was a hastily put together scheme out of necessity, but perhaps there could have been some different decisions along the way. So, and what this means is, well, the first sort of devolution or diffusion of responsibility was handing it back down to local authorities. And I suppose we can be critical of this, because it's being handed down to those very same local authorities who've been cut to the bone. And there's money put there, so there is money to fund it, but the infrastructure and the resourcing wasn't necessarily there, so local authorities had to create new infrastructures to be able to deal with it. So somebody in a large southern local authority talked about the scale of the ask. They said they needed a whole team of people wrapped around it, and they didn't have a whole team of people. You know, it takes time to recruit. You might be given a budget that has to go a long way, and you have to recruit new staff, and you have to train them, and nobody knows what they're doing. The massive pressure on local councils and district councils with resources they haven't got. The large Northern Council spoke about it was a logistical feast and called it an admin-heavy scheme. They had to set up new payment. All local authorities had to set up new payment systems. The payment systems didn't necessarily speak to the central systems. You know, they had to, all this sort of new data management had to go on, and the actual people to resource the scheme, to check the homes, you know, to do the security checks, you know, all these sorts of things. So I found that a lot of these local authorities, their workload just shot up to try and accommodate this. Even when we look at the overall numbers, not huge compared to other countries. In this context, it felt like a lot of numbers. And conversations talked about this lack of central planning. Nobody seemed to say we shouldn't be doing it. I don't think there was any question that we shouldn't be doing it. That didn't come through in any of the interviews. The frustration was, it's just hard and we need resourcing. We shouldn't have been cut so bare already. It's difficult. But everyone I spoke to actually really wanted to do it. And it leads into those arguments about frontline workers. The person from the Welsh local authority was doing home checks and was really, really sort of tied in emotionally to that work, checking people were okay, feeling really worried about them. So it's unfair to say there's no state. The state is there, it's devolved, it's in this local authority, it's in the labour of those people, but they're working in a very difficult environment, I would say. But this lack of central planning then and this reluctance to enter that domestic space has consequences, and we have to point that out. I think, again, it's only fair, and it's only fair for any future scheme or schemes elsewhere to be able to point out maybe what didn't work here or what's been questionable. And I think one of the biggest problems with the Homes for Ukraine scheme is there hasn't been a formal process of matching hosts and guests. And I don't know how that's worked elsewhere, maybe people will be able to tell me. But in the UK, there just hasn't been a central database, there hasn't been any oversight on matching people. And when Johnny Darling talks about how awful the housing dispersal is in the UK, it is horrendous, but there is a process. People find people homes. Here, there was no process. And it was basically up to people to use social media. Ukrainian women were putting photos of themselves on Facebook, trying to find somewhere, to stay. I spoke to Apora, one of the main charities that's emerged in the UK supporting Ukrainians, and they were basically disgusted about this. They said that there'd been not much other information, there was no framework, no structure, no guidance, nothing really. And on the official government website, how do I find someone to sponsor? Because people had signed up, a lot of people had signed up wanting to sponsor. They said, go on Facebook, social media, that kind of stuff, which is obviously silly. So we know from other hosting schemes that reliable oversight is really important, to reduce some of that risk. But I think the Homes for Ukraine hasn't done that. And we've seen huge third sector response. And I spoke to people who took it upon themselves to matchmake. There was an international aid worker who basically dropped everything and just devoted her time to vetting. It's a huge hole. It's a huge work, but it's also something that needed to be thought of and should be thought of for other schemes. And it's not hard to think of the sexualized risks that come with this reliance on social media. Rosello in Post-Colonial Hospitality talks about how hospitality always involves risks. That's the sort of payoff. But here, I think this risk could have been mitigated. One of the charity workers was really upset about this because, again, they were working at the coalface, they were seeing this. He said there's a Polish activist, he labelled the UK scheme Tinder for refugees, which is an apt quote. And Mariska, who I spoke to from Ukraine, was really troubled by this. She'd made the really difficult decision to leave, she'd thought about how to get out, and then it was, how do I find a host? She had to find her host. She had to put her picture on Facebook and scout around, trying to find somebody, trying to verify who that person might be. She said, I received some messages from just single men about, could I be your sponsor, please? Come, everything, I'll meet you at the airport, I'll give you a room, everything will be fine. But I said, excuse me, sorry, I'm afraid. She didn't know how to vet, she just knew that, and I think that single men weren't supposed to be allowed to host. So obviously, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with single men, but in this context, as a Ukrainian woman, she felt wary, and there were guidelines about who should be hosting and who shouldn't. And clearly, and there were lots of cases of things that went wrong and abusive hostings. And I certainly spoke to 3 people who had to change their hosting because of problems. So it was a real risk. So we've had, if we're talking about responsibility, we've had that very clear risk that I think would need more mitigation and resourcing and effort and infrastructure. I'm not saying it's easy. But if we think about what responsibility as we go down the line, what that looks like, I think it's really interesting to think more carefully about what it means to be a host. And again, the hosts I spoke to were so excited to share It was a huge deal for them. We will talk about the actual Ukrainian women in a minute, but it was a really important part of their life. This was fascinating, actually, because for a lot of these people, it was the most important thing they'd done in their life, to open up their home, and they were proud to do it. For a lot of the women I spoke to, the hosting was just a small part of their narrative. It was just another chapter in something much bigger. But for the hosts, this was the defining thing they wanted to talk to. So I thought that was an interesting thing that I need to think about more. But for the hosts, it clearly was a big effort. And they were doing it very willingly, and there was a lot of love and care. And there's some interesting literature about infrastructures of care, power, and our 2022, I think it might be in the references, about creating these different spaces of care. And this is what the hosts were doing. It was far more than just the bare bones responsibility. So they were rearranging their homes, they were creating welcome packs. A lot of these hosts were quite well off. They had spare rooms, they lived in nicer areas. A third were retired that I spoke to, so they had a bit more time, but not everyone. One couple in Wales, they said, our son vacated his bedroom and is sleeping in the front room now, because they wanted to host so much, they actually rearranged their domestic space to that extent. But it was the care that went into the preparation, the welcome packs, the slippers, the shower gel, all the stuff that people were preparing for these welcomes for people. And Vanessa, I thought this was really important. She said, I read up about it, and basically the advice was that one of the most important things for refugees is to feel safe. So I got a lock for her bedroom door. I thought this was really important, that thinking and the effort that went into that. So hosts were doing a lot of preparation and a lot of responsibility to make sure their houses were safe, welcoming, clean, decluttered, some more successful than others, basically. But it became clear in the interviews that the responsibility was more than just the physical shelter and the material shelter. And if we think about this devolved responsibility, we can make these hosts are almost becoming, I suppose, we use Lipsky as street-level bureaucrats. These are becoming home-level bureaucrats. They're in charge of a huge part of the resettlement. In the first couple of months, hosts are helping to coordinate BRP, or biometric residency permit applications. Universal Credit, our welfare system in the UK. Job interviews, job centre interviews, schools, school places, school uniforms, doctor's appointments, dentist, it's impossible in the UK to get a dentist. But all these things, hosts were responsible for doing that, and there was no one there. And especially in the early days, the local authorities weren't in a position to step in and do that. They were still grappling with the system and trying to recruit people. So these hosts had no idea what they were taking on in that sense. And a lot of them, their advice to future hosts was take time off, clear your diary because you're going to be incredibly busy. So there's all the bureaucratic stuff. But then there was also the trauma support. And some people had been foster carers before or worked in certain caring roles, but a lot hadn't. And the reality of living closely with people who are plugged in to the war and struggling, is difficult when people don't really know how to help, don't know when to back off, when to try and talk. It came through, and it was definitely very gendered. A lot of the women seemed to say that they were taking on more of there were gendered responsibilities here for that day-to-day noticing and the caring and the awareness of the interpersonal dynamics in the home. So Lauren said, well, I've been the kind of main support for our guests. It's just been so much more responsibility than I thought it would. And that's my fault for being naive, I'll accept that. But I do feel like hosts, we've been misled. What they say we're responsible for on paper, but the reality is it's so much more. It's so much more work and responsibility. The idea was you open up your home and it's a room, but the reality was much more. And I suppose inevitably it would be, but people weren't necessarily prepared for that. So I think there's important things to think about here about, bringing that settlement, bringing the domestic space, creating it as a place of refugee settlement and what that means. And I don't want to be all negative. It's just that the negatives seem to have this consequential risk that seems really important. But there were really important success stories. There was reciprocity, there were friendships, there was care, You know, some things went really well, and on both sides you could see that it had gone well. And the home environment did create that homeliness, the material comforts. You know, that's not to be denied or denigrated. That's incredibly important. When other people are being put on a barge with airborne diseases and, you know, basically imprisoned, you know, to be in someone's spare room with a toiletries hamper and a bedroom lock that you can choose when to come and go is incredibly significant. So there's a lot to be said for it, actually. But it also brings that, you know, brings those heightened responsibilities. It's a more intense environment in a home than it is in a daycare, you know, or day centre. If you're a refugee volunteer, support volunteer, you know, it's much more intense. Those timelines are intense. You know, the intricacies of the day, you know, become interwoven, and with the timelines going on in Ukraine. And of course, as we said, domestic spaces aren't automatically safe. So yeah, there was a really heartbreaking interview with somebody who'd left a hosting because the male host had started to tell them off about how they placed the handles of the cups on the shelf, and was going into her teenage daughter's bedroom without asking. So she had to, and she had local authority support to move. But the risks were huge, and it took her a little while to pick up on these risks. It was a really nice welcome, she arrived, everything seemed fine. After 2 months, she noticed things didn't feel right, and it was up to her to protect her children again and to move again. So we have to be very careful when we think about what the domestic space means. But also there's a danger that in this, when hosts are so responsible for resettlement, guests become really dependent on their way of doing it, or their knowledge, their approach. It can be disempowering if you're obviously relying on somebody all the time. And on the one hand, it's great because someone can help you do it, but you're so reliant on that guest and the way that host and the way they do it. And sometimes it doesn't leave you, you know, to learn for yourself. Kai Askins talks about trapping people in refugee scripts. So there's a danger that misalignment of power, that asymmetry is entrenched in the domestic space. Because you're in the host home, you know, the king of their castle, and you're there as a guest. So not only are you on the back foot as a refugee, you're on the back foot in the domestic space, just like the au pairs are. You know, it can entrench and amplify those asymmetries. So we have to be very careful, I think, when we open up these spaces. And through the guests, it was clear that there was a reliance on hosts. And for some it became uneasy, for some it was gratitude, and we can talk about that, you know, another day. You know, but it was clear that, you know, if you're that reliant on your host, it can be a bit unnerving. Olena was hosted in Wales with her daughter. She said, for the people that you're hosting, and it was sort of advice to hosts as well, the sponsor is everything. Because when you come here, you don't know the rules, you don't know the laws, you don't understand how everything works. Basically, you know, you can't help yourself. So you're relying on the sponsor for everything. And then Olga, who's hosted in the north of England, said about her host, without her, I don't know, maybe I couldn't do it myself. So it's big work what we've done during the first 2 months. And I think it's, you know, it really sets up that danger of reinscribing those risks. And it would be a disservice to say that the women I spoke to were passive and, you know, were reliant, because actually they weren't. So many of them were highly educated, or not that you know, matters, but or had their own business before, or were really trying to set themselves up to work, were trying to take on more responsibility. But I think the structures made it quite difficult to do that. So there's another discussion there about the agency of being a refugee as well, and it was certainly there. And a lot of the women I spoke to were setting up volunteer groups for other Ukrainian women as well. But yeah, so if we think about what all this means in terms, you know, we talked about domestic space. The other thing to think about is the temporalities of hosting, because I think it's really, really important to think about where we are with time. One of the problems with the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which is sort of valid for the wider directive protecting refugees, is that there's been a 3-year sort of ballpark figure that this is what we work towards. So those visas, you know, could well expire at the end of 3 years. In the UK, there hasn't been any word yet what that means. When I wrote the article, we still didn't know that the funding would continue for the scheme, that hosts would still get payments, that local authorities would still get support. And it was due to expire in March this year, and there was a last-minute decision after I submitted my paper, the revisions in December, I think, that the funding had been agreed. You know you're working on a 2 or 3 month sort of. It doesn't give you a lot of time to work it out. So there is a real sort of insecurity about timelines of this. But for hosting, it's temporary. Like, because of the levels of responsibility, for hosts, I think it's really important to have a timeline or an endpoint. I might have this on another slide as well. Because they're happy to do it, but it's intense and they need an endpoint. And that's really difficult in these timelines. You know, how do you have the conversations? And that sort of feeling that, you know, you're vulnerable, that you're reliant on the whim of your host to know how long you might be able to stay there. So Yulia talked about this sort of, you know, feeling unsettled, feeling abandoned, you know, not knowing what the future held. And so I'll quote her. She said, "No one ever checked, no one even called." So yeah, she's feeling quite reliant on her host here. I'm not even talking about knocking on the door and checking, which I feel they should do, you know, regular checks, you know, unexpectedly knock on your door and ask how you are, but no one even called. So it's just constantly, you kind of have to be prepared for anything. And it really makes you, because you're already tense about everything that's happening, and you're already like constantly worried, and it's just another thing that doesn't really let you settle. You always have it in the back of your mind, the back of your head, that it might work out, and might not work out. That yeah, you think you know the person, your host. You think they're all right, but what if you get kicked out tomorrow? So it's that uncertainty, that insecurity. Again, it's a better setup than a lot of people, but it has those insecurities sort of inscribed into it. And what happens after? Well, in the UK, as I think you've got here, but I think it's probably worse in the UK, there is a housing crisis. You know, where do people move on to? Private rents are ridiculously high now. We have a lack of social housing. It's been cut, you know, for the last few decades. There isn't a lot of housing. There certainly isn't accessible, easy housing to get. You know, there's been a lot of writings on how refugees can navigate the housing market. You know, in the UK, you get into bidding wars just to rent somewhere. Agents can deny, landlords can deny renting to you if you're on welfare, even though legally they're not supposed to. If they do, nobody can really check. It's very, very difficult. You don't have the money up front. You don't necessarily have a guarantor, which we'll see in a minute. So it's a really difficult thing. And there is not this pool of, you know, affordable housing. Certainly not in the areas where people have settled, where they've lived with a host, they've got to know the area, their kids have joined a school. You know, they're looking to move, you know, significantly further away. And the hosts are very worried about these dodgy areas they might move to as well. And if hosts want an end to this, the thing that shocked them was they had to make their guests homeless. They could have an end to the hosting, and they signed up for 6 months or 12 months, but the reality was a lot of that was going over. They had to actively make them homeless, and then they would be deposited into a system where they could bid for social housing or try and get rental or whatever. And the host was sort of shocked, like, I don't want to make this person homeless. I've been looking after or with them for months. You know, really, really difficult. And what you see is some hosts, you know, the responsibility, Refugees at Home, another charity I spoke with, they said hosts don't lose their responsibility necessarily after guests leave. And what I've seen is hosts have been actually acting as guarantors, stumping up a lot of money for private rentals, trying to help people sort of, you know, make that next step, you know, putting down big deposits, far more sort of financial responsibility than they were. And the councils have been telling them not to do it. Some councils have been acting as guarantors. Again, each council's doing it differently. It's a dispersed, diffused, messy landscape of responsibility again. And the people who've had success stories, and this is the bit that I think is really heartbreaking as well, is I spoke to some women who have had success stories. They're now in their own flat. a social housing or rental flat. Or some of them are in rooms in share room, a sort of a website where you find a room. Again, it's sharing with strangers. I'm sure that's probably, for younger people, that's probably normal. But, it's going through that process of sharing with people you don't know again. A landlord you don't know and you don't trust. One woman I spoke with who has a child, she's paying £950 a month Airbnb. And, that's pretty much wiped out any welfare she gets. And she's trying to support her child. There's nothing tangible, in those structures to offer. So as a great sort of immediate response, but really lacking, that wider follow-on. So it sort of underlines the lack of sustainability, I think. And to go back to the geopolitics of the home, what was really clear in the interviews was these discussions are really difficult. You cannot sit down with your guests and have a discussion about when this is going to end. Lots of those women want to go back. They're watching anxiously the news. They don't want to put a time limit on when they're going to go back to Ukraine. They'd have gone back if they could. Nobody knows when this will end, but we do know that the funding might end in the UK. We do know that the visas could expire or they might not. I'm always struck, there's fantastic research about refugees and the temporalities of limbo and the bureaucratic violence of visas not appearing, or the very slow bureaucracy and paperwork. And we've almost got the opposite here, because we had a very quick response bureaucratically. There'll be gripes about visas, but actually it happened quite quickly in the UK context. But what we don't know is how long it will last, and there's no discussion. So it's like cliff edge, and it's not acknowledged. It's sort of, this could just end. It's a different kind of bureaucratic violence, and I haven't come up with the right words to describe it. But I think it hangs over the scheme, for the people in it. So there's lots more I could say about this. There's so much stuff in the interviews with the Ukrainian women in particular, and I'm looking forward to delving into the home space more and thinking about, what happens in that space as a hosting. But I wanted to think about responsibility first, because I think in the UK context, and you probably understand about our hostile environment agenda, I forgot to mention that, but we don't have a very kind discourse to refugees in the UK, and I'm sure that's not unique, across Europe or anywhere. So it was a really interesting conundrum that we would have this scheme that was so ostensibly warm and welcoming in a climate where it really isn't a welcoming environment for anybody. And in my other project, I'm looking at the fallout of Brexit, and we're constantly being bombarded with news about new salary hikes for international residents. Just the opportunities to come to the UK are being shrunk, all the time. So it was intriguing. This arrangement offers so much more than most people get in the UK. And when you get a good host, it can be amazing. It can be really fulfilling, really empowering. Some hosts really wanted to empower, but the risks are they're really strong. If you get the hosts aren't necessarily supported. You don't know what's going on in that domestic space, and there are some real pitfalls. About the vetting particularly. So I think. And the host responsibility, not being sure what they were taking on until it was too late. So it's easy to, critique this, and I think that we cannot let the scheme off, particularly for the vetting. And women should not have been touting pictures on Facebook to try and find somewhere. I don't know how, but that should have been addressed. And the overall potential of the scheme, well, if we're going to do it again in the UK, we have to think very carefully about the world that is around it. You might have a wonderful hosting home full of nice things and care and support, but that's a home. The homes are made through and within the world around them. And unfortunately in the UK, if we look at housing, it's a very, very difficult housing environment. So a hosting scheme which doesn't take the housing environment into account is only going to be so good for so long. So thank you very much. That's just plug my article that I'm very excited. I'd probably say more in it. I don't think I could do it justice today, but yes, I was very excited to see it out in Antipode last week. So thank you, everybody.